friends. My name is Leanne Wasilewski, and I want to echo Brian's welcome. I'm so thankful to see so many of you here, really, really excited for this conversation. A little bit about me. I am just facilitating tonight, so really, really privileged to be able to share the stage with two incredible attorneys who have dedicated so much of their lives to helping those that are living in the margins. I am also so excited to be able to serve on the leadership side of our justice ministry team. I also work in lay leadership here at our church for several years. I'm a member of Good Shepherd. I also have an MDiv, a Master's of Divinity from St. Paul School of Theology, and very, very proudly am, oh man, watch out, friends. My goal today was to not cry, and we are losing immediately. I'm also very, very proudly the granddaughter of a Mexican immigrant, and so this subject particularly touches me very, very deeply, which is why, it's going to happen. It's just going to be what happens. We're all just going to go on a journey together. In addition, as somebody who has really just been so blessed to be able to study theology, I also think that when we look at a subject like immigration, in today's context, it may seem like a deeply political issue. It is not. When we look to the biblical text, we can very clearly see that it doesn't take a careful reading of the biblical text to see how God would have us feel toward the foreigner. Not only that, again, it may seem like a challenging, nuanced subject when we look at it today, and yet we know that when God came in flesh, fully human, he came as a refugee. So again, I think it's important for us to take a look at this context, not only for how we would examine it today from our overall societal value, but also how we might examine it from a biblical context, from a context of Christians. And so I'm so thankful to also be joined by two incredible human beings who not only speak out of a level of legal advocacy and education, but also from the lens of those who would call themselves Christian. I'm going to introduce these two incredible human beings. This is Andrea Martinez. She's the founder of Martinez Immigration Law LLC. She brings extensive experience across family-based immigration, naturalization, removal, defense, and humanitarian visas. She's also served in executive leadership roles in the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Also joining us is Roger McCrummen, managing partner of McCrummen and McCullick Immigration Law Group with decades of experience. Andrea has called him several times the grandfather of immigration in Kansas City. He is also extensive experience across employment-based immigration, family petitions, asylum and advocacy. He also founded the Asylum Clinic of Kansas City to support asylum seekers with pro bono resources. Rogers also has an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary. So please welcome Andrea Martinez and Roger McCrummen. So Andrea and Roger, my first question for you is just simply, what led you to this specialization? And in this space, do you consider it a calling?
Roger?
Absolutely a calling, yes. I actually had been a lawyer for 15 years before I did any immigration work. I started out as a lawyer in New York City doing corporate transaction work and got dissatisfied with it, and that's when I went to seminary, and then moved with my family to Kansas City because my wife was from Kansas City and her family was here, and I started all over, and I started doing immigration law, really just by chance. I mean, somebody referred something to us, and I got really fascinated with it, and I had never had a course in immigration law or anything like that, but my first case really was a Somali asylum case, and in the course of that, I had this epiphany that this is what I should be doing, and then it's kind of like, you know how when you're reading scripture and stuff, all of a sudden something stands out to you that you'd never noticed before, even though you've read that verse 100 times. And all of a sudden I started seeing everything in the scripture about immigrants and foreigners and strangers and, and all of that. And it really solidified to me that this is what I was called to do. And I did a lot of different things before I started doing this. I've been doing it now for more than 30 years, but I've never thought about doing anything else since I started. So it definitely for me was, a calling. And that's what we've emphasized when we've hired people. I mean, you remember this too. Yeah, anytime we've hired anybody, we present it that way. I don't care where you finished in your law school class. I want to know, are you committed to helping those that are powerless in our society?
Andrea?
So I got to work with Roger for 7 years at the beginning of my career. It's such an honor because he was such a great mentor to me as a Christian and as a young lawyer. But I actually went to college at a Christian college in Arkansas, John Brown University, and I got a Bible degree. I thought I was going to be an overseas missionary and really believed that's what God's calling was on my life. And then my junior year at JBU, a group of human rights lawyers came to a chapel service at our college campus, and it was International Justice Mission, a group of lawyers that are known for the knocking down the brothel doors and freeing the sex slaves in Thailand. You might have seen that in the news. And they told us about injustice in the world and explained to us that God's heart is to free the oppressed and to fight injustice, and how that is part of the whole biblical story. It was the first time I had heard about this kind of injustice, and I thought, I'm going to go be a human rights lawyer. I'm going to go work for them. So I really felt God changing my career path from being a missionary, which I thought was the spiritual route, to going to be a lawyer, which felt like the least spiritual thing you can do, right? And because I had this vision of being a human rights lawyer, and I did end up going to work in Guatemala prosecuting child sex offenders for a year with IJM, with International Justice Mission, but realized that I have a U.S. law degree, and I needed to come back to the U.S. and figure out what being a human rights lawyer means in the U.S., in the context of the U.S. And at that same time, I married my Honduran husband, Jorge, and did his immigration paperwork. And I was shocked at how complicated it was. And also, I learned Spanish while I was in Guatemala and thought, well, immigrants are humans, so immigrants' rights are human rights. Duh. And then I started studying scripture and realizing that passages like Matthew 25, where Jesus is talking about the sheep and the goats, and he's saying, I'm going to separate you, and I'm going to separate you into these categories based on whether you healed the sick, fed the hungry, welcomed the stranger. And that word for stranger in scripture is the Hebrew word ger, which is the foreigner, the immigrant, the refugee. And he says the way that you treated these people, including the way you treated the immigrant, the ger, is the way you treated me.
Well, and I'll just add, in the Matthew 25 passage, it's in the Greek, it's xenos is the word for stranger, from which we get the word xenophobia, But it clearly is talking about stranger or immigrant.
And so this is a calling that we believe is a fulfillment of Scripture. And like you mentioned, our own Savior, Jesus Christ, God called him to be a refugee and flee to Egypt. And often when I see my clients, I see Jesus in them. And I wonder how Jesus and Joseph and Mary were treated when they got to Egypt. Were they welcomed? I'm sure glad they weren't deported back to Israel for Jesus to have been murdered by Herod, right?
Yeah.
So this is why we believe it's a calling.
Absolutely. Well, as Brian said, we thank you for sharing your time with us tonight. Roger and Andrea, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. I would love to know, you have dedicated this time, you have given this time. What are you hoping that everybody here might be able to take away from this event?
I think maybe a clearer understanding of immigration law as people of faith. because it's extremely complicated, and there are a lot of myths surrounding immigrants, things like why didn't they do it the legal way, or those kind of things, where when you understand a little bit about the law, you realize that there's a lot of people who would do everything they could to get legal if they could, but the law just doesn't permit it. And it's not because they're criminals, it's just because we have a system that's very, very difficult to work through.
I think it's so important as people of faith that we study Scripture, that we don't just listen to what our pastor tell us. I mean, it's important to listen to what our pastors tell us, obviously. No offense, pastors. But we also have an obligation to read Scripture, right? To study it for ourselves. I think maybe one of the issues, maybe one of the reasons why we're in the place we're in right now is because people of faith are not reading what the Bible says about immigrants or not putting it into practice. Over 92 times throughout the Old and the New Testament, God says, treat the foreigners as you would want to be treated. Treat the foreigners as the citizen. And then in the New Testament, Jesus talks about Matthew 25. Also, you may be entertaining angels when you're entertaining these strangers, these foreigners. You don't know whether one of these immigrants that you're coming across might be an angel. So there are passages throughout the Old and New Testament, so many, that I think we need to go back and maybe do a study on to remind ourselves of our calling. And then from there, that's the foundation that then we build on to say, okay, how do we fix this problem? Because like Roger said, we haven't had an immigration reform, a true immigration reform since Reagan. And so we're in the mess we're in today because the system is so broken and has not been updated in decades.
Yeah, it's interesting that throughout the Old Testament in particular, there's 4 groups that are mentioned over and over that the Lord has special regard for, and it's the widows, the orphans, the poor, and the immigrants, the strangers. And when I noticed that, I started wondering, like, why do you lump immigrants in with? I mean, it's pretty easy to see widows, orphans, and the poor. Well, these are the groups that have the least power in society. They're the most vulnerable in society, and the Lord, who sides with people like that, has a special regard for them.
Mm-hmm. Appreciate that. So I think that each of us come kind of experiencing just a little bit of our own stories, but I also want to know how do you guys see ways that immigration matters show up in our society that most people don't see?
You go first on this one.
Yeah. That people don't, well, I feel like everybody's seeing everything right now.
Yeah,
it's like the first time that I'm like, now everybody's seeing what I saw for like a decade.
Yeah.
So,
Even just the small ways in which an immigrant lives in life that maybe we don't recognize, that we haven't had a lens on.
I think many people don't actually know an immigrant, aren't actually friends with an immigrant. And so one thing that I think is really important to share is the story of Luis. How many people, raise your hands if you watched the Living Undocumented documentary?
That's a lot.
It was a powerful one, right? It was executive produced by Selena Gomez. You might have seen me in it. Yeah, I didn't choose to be in it, but it happened, so here we are. And so the end of the story, at least for now, is that Luis just got deported. Yeah. Kenya just had his baby, and he wasn't there for it. His kids are going to be raised without a dad. He had just finished work in my office. He had just finished work in my parents' house. He had work authorization, and he was driving to work one day. No criminal history. We'd just gotten him out of the deportation process. And he was surrounded by ICE and IRS patrol cars, picked up, detained, told that he couldn't have a bond. A guy with no criminal history and U.S. citizen kids couldn't have a bond. We fought for him until the very end, but he had a tooth while he was detained that was infected, and he was begging to get medical care. And Megan, my law partner that you probably saw in the documentary, was representing him, trying to reach out to the jail, asking them to get him medical care for this tooth. They would not send a dentist, and he was in so much pain that he was gargling with his own urine. And he begged us to let him get, it's called voluntary departure. It's a type of, self-removal, because he was potentially going to die of a tooth infection. And so that's what we did. And he's in Honduras now, and his family is here.
Yeah, that's one of the evils of detention right now, is that they treat them so cruelly in order to persuade them to voluntarily leave and give up any rights they might have to stay here. There's just tons and tons of stories of people being denied medical care in detention.
So I think it's important that we hear the story of the one and not the masses, right? Because it's easy to talk about these people as if they're not human, as if it's just some kind of lump of, I don't know, a herd of cattle or something. But every person has a story. Many of these people are in mixed status families. And to have done that to Luis, like, I love Luis. My family loves Luis. Like, my kids are his kids' age. And he's one of the best people I know. Such a good guy. And he didn't deserve this.
Yeah, I think, getting to celebrate diversity is something. It sounds funny because there's such a movement from the administration to attack diversity, but being around immigrants, you come to really love that difference. I love that. I lived in New York City for 12 years, and I didn't do any immigration law there, but I loved the immigrant communities. It was so fun to rub shoulders with them and go to their parades and stuff like that. And I think the people that are most anti-immigrant right now are the people who have the least contact with them, but they are hardworking. And I tell people all the time that the most patriotic Americans that I've ever met are people who are naturalized, because they've come from someplace that with a different experience, a lot of times without freedoms, and have worked hard and gone through the system, and they really love America, because they much more, in my experience, than people who are born here and just sort of take it for granted.
Yeah.
That's something that I've always said about my grandfather, is that the way that he viewed the United States, and he has passed, but he came to the United States in the 1920s when he was in his early 20s. And I always looked at the way that he viewed the United States, the way that he was willing to sacrifice all of his security, the language that he spoke, the family that he had, and in pursuit of something better for a country that he so deeply believed in. And while I love our country, I've always said that he is so much more of a patriot than I would ever dream to be.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I've thought of our immigration system as kind of a fraternity hazing system, because it's so hard to get through it that when you do successfully get through, you really appreciate it. You really fall in love with it.
So, and Andrea, you've hit on this, especially with the story of Kenya and Luis, but I know that for so many of us, immigration becomes a matter of headlines, of news stories, and yet when we bring it down into the personal, it certainly shifts the perspective that we have when we can identify with an individual human. And so I think that being able to see your story, the story of Kenya and Luis, when we looked at living undocumented, in particular in the eyes of Noah, Kenya's little boy, that certainly shifts and changes things. And I know that you shared that Luis is tragically not able to be in this country right now. one portion of that story that many of you would have been able to see was that as Andrea and her partner Megan were advocating on behalf of their clients, they had an interaction with some of the agents, and in particular, one agent that many of us could witness, or that we have the ability to go back on Netflix and witness if you'd like, was that one of those agents physically assaulted you as you were trying to lawfully advocate for your client. One of the more chilling parts of that, not only witnessing your assault, but was hearing you chat about the fears that you had, knowing that this was something that was caught on camera, that was out in public, that everybody was able to view. Can you talk to me a little bit about knowing that you were treated in that way under the protection of being a U.S. citizen? How did that incident frame your continued work and the misuse and the criminality that you saw in that space?
Yeah, it was a lot. I have a really good therapist. I'm thankful for my therapist. We ended up in a 5-year lawsuit against those ICE agents and against the United States of America. It took 5 years, even though we had video and audio about everything that they did. For those who didn't see the documentary, we were instructed to enter a building, an ICE building, by these 2 ICE agents. And as my law partner and I were entering the building with our 3-year-old client, it was at the time, if you remember, when the Trump administration, in the first administration, was separating the parents from the kids. You probably saw it in the news. And Noah was 3 years old at that time and had been separated from his mother. And we happened to be representing this family pro bono without fee. And we were being told to return this 3-year-old to his mother, who had been detained inside of this ICE office. And as my law partner and I entered, as we were told to enter the facility, they took the boy and Luis, who I was just telling you about, which is his stepdad, pushed them inside the building, and then threw Megan and I out, threw me to the ground, broke my foot, and I ended up with a concussion. And we had pastors, peaceful protesters that were watching all this. It was 3 a.m, and they were singing peaceful songs and filming. And there was a film crew there that ended up being the Netflix film crew. So what was terrifying about it was afterwards they called me back into the building and then locked me in a room and took my phone, wouldn't let me have my phone back. And at this point, my foot is swelling, and I'm realizing that something's very wrong with my foot, because this part of my foot was like getting huge. And I was like, I need medical attention. And the ICE agent was like, no, I'm not getting you medical attention. And it was my first moment in my life. I was raised very privileged in Kansas City, to a middle-class family, white family, obviously, and I had never experienced being treated like that. And I had this weird moment, like, am I in Russia? How am I getting locked in a room and being told I can't get medical attention when you just assaulted me and threw me to the ground? My foot's swelling. Thankfully, my law partner was outside. They wouldn't let her in, and she was calling ambulances and the police. And the police were trying to enter the facility, but the ICE agents wouldn't let them, and finally they were banging on the door, and ICE agents let an ambulance come in and roll me out in a stretcher. So that experience opened my eyes to, and then of course the 5 years after that of suing them for what they did, being represented by the ACLU, thank God, because there's no way I could have afforded those legal fees for 5 years of litigation. And it really gave me an empathy for how other members of our community who are not as privileged and white as I am have maybe experienced injustice, and then a justice system that felt like it was against them. I even going, seeing that these law enforcement officers were not punished criminally for what they did. They settled the civil lawsuit, but how can that be? I mean, how can you assault a U.S. citizen and not be charged criminally for your actions? And so now, of course, what we saw last week was very triggering, and I'm closely watching that case because I don't know how it's going to turn out for Renee Good and her family. I I mean, obviously, we know what happened to Renee Good, but for Renee Good's family, for her son, for her orphan son now, and her wife, and it brought up a lot of emotions in me because this was my story. Except for I, thank God, wasn't murdered, but I was assaulted, and it could have easily gone a different way now, seeing the way that things are currently. So, did I answer your question?
And you have to say that, as bad as that was, and we saw what was happening then as a policy separating children from parents in order to be a deterrent to immigration, it's 10 times worse now. I mean,
Right.
Like you told me in there that agent finally got let go. He wouldn't be let go today.
No.
Absolutely would not.
He'd probably have a GoFundMe
Yeah.
yeah. So it's a different environment, which is heartbreaking.
It certainly is. It certainly is. Well, Roger, you focus on employment-based immigration. Can you outline for us, first off, just what that means and how that scope of work impacts our community?
I think of, in a broad sense, there's kind of three ways of legally immigrating to the U.S. That one is family-based immigration. Somebody marries someone who's a citizen, they can sponsor them. And one is humanitarian immigration, which could be things like asylum and temporary protected status, and there's several categories that kind of fall in that. And then the other is employment-based immigration. So that's typically employers who have sponsored a foreign national based on a job offer. And there are some employment-based that don't require a job offer, like we have extraordinary ability aliens, like, some scientists and stuff like that can petition for themselves. But typically, they go through a long process of, and most of these that we see are professionals, because the system is kind of designed that way. There's not a good non-immigrant temporary visa for somebody to come and work in like a packing plant or something like that. So they're typically professionals. And the typical scenario I would see would be somebody maybe goes to school at KU and they get an engineering degree, they get a year of practical training where they can work for a U.S. employer, and then the employer decides to take them on long-term, and they try to get a work visa, which is typically what we call an H-1B. And then if they really like them, they can sponsor them for a green card for permanent residence. For some people, that can take literally decades, 20 years or more, and particularly if you're from India. And that has to do with quotas and things like that we have in our system. And these professionals function in a very important way in our society. Like the studies have shown that each H-1B, for example, an H-1B is just for professionals. And they define professional as a job that requires a bachelor's degree at least in a specialized area. So like engineers and IT professionals and stuff like that. Each one of those jobs typically creates 3.5 jobs for U.S. citizens. So they're a boon to the economy, even though you'll see a lot of people criticize and think they're taking jobs away from Americans. But there's a lot of protections in the system. It's very complex. But they have to pay them wages that don't disadvantage U.S. workers. They can't hire them if there's strikes and lockouts and things like that. So there's a lot of protections for U.S. workers in there, but it literally can take decades to get through that process. And if they lose their job in the meantime, they may have to start all over or have to leave the country because they've run out of a non-immigrant work visa time. So typically we're representing a lot of employers that hire people like this, and even the employers that hire a lot of H-1Bs, it's typically 1 or 2% of their workforce. It's not, at least that's in my experience. I mean, maybe there's more that seem like they're abusing the system, but there's proposals now to make it even more difficult. And one of the problems too is that we have a limit on how many can be approved each year. And so we actually do a lottery system to see which cases will even be adjudicated. And so we go to all this work and file something, And it doesn't meet the demand that the employers have. So the employers are constantly calling me saying, is there any other way we can get the workers that we need? And our system just doesn't accommodate those needs. Even the H-1Bs, several years back, the quota was 195,000 a year. It's 85,000 now. But our economy has grown, these employers. And so the result has been that they tend to offshore talent because they can't get the workers in the U.S. that they need because of the restrictions of our immigration system. And that doesn't benefit our economy to offshore them. So anyway, it's a whole different world than what we talk about with immigration, with humanitarian and removal and everything like that. My clients in the employment-based world, they're all here in legal status. They're just trying to get through the system, and it takes forever. It's easy to get messed up, and it's a very stressful for the workers that are here, and yet they provide a tremendous value to the U.S. and to our economy.
Thank you. I want to know, Andrea, you've spoke about the murder of Renee Good. And I just cannot help but think, as a U.S. citizen, obviously her death impacts so many of us, and it certainly impacts me very differently than I'm sure it impacts many of your clients. So I want to know, in light of these violent interactions that we've seen and the death of Renee Good, I know that our communities have responded so significantly. But how do your clients feel, and how has it shifted the way that they are currently experiencing the world?
They're terrified. My clients are terrified every day, even the ones with status. That's the interesting thing. Even my husband, who's a U.S. citizen. The Supreme Court recently ruled that ICE agents can racially profile on the basis of being Spanish-speaking or looking Hispanic. So, it makes even people with U.S. citizenship or people that were born here scared. And I've got clients with legal status that call me every day and say, am I safe? And, at this point, I don't know if anybody's safe. I mean, how can you?
They're afraid to travel.
They can't, that's exactly right, even domestically. And I have permanent resident clients who should be able to travel internationally, who don't want to travel internationally. So just a ton of fear. It's a really scary time.
I have a Iraqi that works in my office who is a naturalized U.S. citizen. He helped our troops when he was a translator, and he came in on a special visa, U.S. citizen now. And I tell him, make sure you carry papers with you because, but most of us, I don't carry evidence of my U.S. citizenship around.
Right.
Never even thought about doing that. But we tell people who are not white that they should. Even people, like you said, that are born here, but maybe Hispanic, there is a terror-based system right now. And there's a lot of fear and a lot of hate, and it's something we need to support each other on.
And to that point, now recognizing that so many of us have either had interactions or will continue to have interactions, how would you say, for immigrant, non-immigrant alike, how can we safely, or as safely as we can think of, how can we engage safely and constructively with these forces? Yeah,
some of the things I've seen, so my daughter and her husband are both educators, and they've pointed out that when something like this happens, a lot of kids don't show up in school the next day, because they're afraid to go out. But I've seen in Minnesota and other places, neighbors, and that's the way we should think of immigrants. They are our neighbors, like Jesus told us to love. They go shopping for them, and so they don't have to leave the house and bring stuff to them. And I think that's great. Or they take them somewhere, in the car so that they're not unaccompanied. And And I think those are good kind of measures. You know, I tell people that, you know, where they say, when they ask where you start, I usually say, you have to start by recognizing them as your neighbor and as humans. And so I actually try to go out of my way if I see somebody who's an immigrant in some context, of just trying to welcome them and treat them like real people. And I think the more we have interaction with them, the more we will really fulfill what Christ wants us to do, I think.
You know, one thing that was just coming to mind is, my first thought when I was going to answer your question was, you know, there are some amazing organizations people can volunteer with, and I'm sure we can talk about that now or later. But, you know, even when you're at a restaurant, maybe you see someone that you think may be foreign-born, and you just look at them in the eyes and smile.
Yeah.
I think that means a lot.
Yeah, I agree.
I think it's just saying, you know,
You belong here.
you belong here. I recognize you, and you're valued. And that's what they need right now, because they're wondering, am I welcome here?
Yeah.
I want this to be my home. I thought this was the American dream that I was pursuing. I thought this is what your ancestors did, and I could do too, is what my clients say. And so I think for them to see a smile from someone who cares about them or just has a warm demeanor would mean a lot right now.
I think that is so powerful, just really in any context, when you are looking at just another human being. How can you make somebody feel welcomed? How can you make them see themselves as a neighbor, as opposed to any other context? Just how can we engage with one another? So I know that for me, my Instagram feed is constantly right now just inundated with all of the different, if you encounter ICE, this is what you should do. What is something that we could use as far as an expectation of, if we were to encounter ICE, if we were to see somebody else encountering ICE, what should we do?
The first thing you should do is pick up your phone and record. You need to be filming immediately. Without video evidence, good luck litigating. That's my...
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, it's hard to know what to say, how confrontational you should be. I mean, we're certainly seeing a lot of that, but I do think the video, because, I mean, honestly, what we're seeing from the administration are lies about ICE agents and their activities. And you saw it in the Renee Good thing. I mean, immediately they're on the air saying she's a domestic terrorist, you know, and that she tried to run him over and he's recovering in the hospital. And, you know, none of that was true. But we see that over and over. That's not even an isolated case. And so the video evidence helps with that. But, yeah, I don't know. It depends on how, I mean, yeah. I don't know what to say.
I know.
You know,
it's tough right now because you don't want to get shot.
Yeah, and also it's just even hard to know what the rights are. You know, like we talk about know your rights a lot, and I mean, even today, Andrea and I were talking about the fact that there's a memo now with ICE that says that it's okay for them to, without a warrant, break down a door and enter somebody's house when they're looking for somebody. Well, that's clearly a violation of the Fourth Amendment, but that is the way the agency is working right now. And so, but, you know, I'm not going to advise somebody to shoot somebody that comes in, you know, even though there's kind of rights to that too, you know. I mean, you can defend yourself, but I think that just exacerbates the problem. And
protests have to be peaceful.
yeah.
That is extremely important. I think what this administration wants is chaos and violence so that they can invoke the Insurrection Act and declare a state of emergency. I'm really concerned about that. So if you do protest, which I hope you do, I really do, it has to be peaceful. Wear like unicorn costumes and blow up chickens or whatever you want to. Those frogs were funny. Those frogs were awesome in Portland. Was it Portland? They did a great job. But it has to stay peaceful, because if not, that's all the administration needs to declare a state of emergency and take military power.
We're 2 days past Martin Luther King Celebration Day, and it is about nonviolent and as Christians, that is the way we should operate too.
That's right.
Nonviolent protest. It has a way of shaming the people who commit violence. And I think that's ultimately a better way of changing things than meeting violence with violence.
I'm encouraged by the amount of protests I'm seeing.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I'm proud.
Same.
I'm proud of us as a nation. I'm proud of us protesting the way that we are. I think that's exactly what makes America great.
I also think that it is a boost to the soul when you can be surrounded by individuals that are also feeling a similar situation to what you're feeling.
That's right.
But, and I think that, Roger, what you had said is exactly right, that as Christians we are called to love, and that must be our first, most paramount thing that we can always focus on. And love is honest, and love is true, and love demands justice, but love is not violent and cannot respond to violence with violence. So in that same spirit, what local services, nonprofits, organizations, Andrea, as you mentioned earlier, can we potentially support in regard to our immigrant neighbors?
Well, if I can put in a shameless plug for Roger's nonprofit, the Asylum Clinic of Kansas City is doing amazing work. And you probably have seen some unaccompanied minors that need representation and are not getting it. It's Roger's nonprofit that does that, and they could always use funds, because I think that did you lose a grant or something at the beginning of this
Well,
semester?
yeah, the federal grants we had are going away, yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, yeah, there's a Supreme Court case that requires the government to provide legal representation for unaccompanied minors, and they are, but they're taking that away. So, but we've also gotten a lot of good response from. I don't actually work for the clinic. I'm on the board, but we've got 4 attorneys that do, and they provide purely pro bono representation. But yeah, we've gotten some nice grants, from other organizations and individuals and stuff too. But yeah, it really was funded in large part by federal grants, which are now being taken away.
So we do certainly want to make sure that there is space and time for individuals to be able to ask questions of Andrea and Roger, but I also want to look just a little bit to some of the myths that we handed out to you this evening. And so wanted to see if you can just address some of those things, and we may not get to all of them, but I want to see if we can address a few of them. So that first question there is, do undocumented immigrants commit more crime?
This one's a really important one, because of course we're hearing that they're all criminals. And I would say of my however many clients I have right now, I don't even know, 300, 400 clients right now, maybe 1 or 2% have a driving without a license ticket. But the answer is no. In fact, undocumented immigrants are less likely to have a criminal record than the native-born population. So we've sent you with this incredible 5 myths with statistics from the American Immigration Council. And it's extremely important, because if we don't know truth, then we can believe whatever we're hearing on the news and think that's true. But we have to go back to the statistics that show that, and this data goes from 1980 to 2022, that the immigrant share of the U.S. population, that the crime rate actually declined by 60%, that there were increased shares of immigrants, places where there were increased shares of immigrants were actually associated with lower violent or property crimes, and in fact, the majority of people detained by ICE have no criminal convictions whatsoever. So when you're hearing on the news, they're all criminals, we're getting the criminals, we're detaining criminals, absolutely false.
Yeah, you have to recognize too that it's not a crime to be in the country without documentation. It's not a crime. It can be a crime to illegally enter the U.S., but even that's a misdemeanor. It's not. But I'll say on top of that, that in some ways, in my mind, it doesn't matter, because there's nothing inherently immoral about crossing a national border. There's not. It's just not. There's nothing inherently immoral about it. Sure, nations have the right to enforce their borders, but we don't dehumanize somebody because they crossed the border. People cross a border for all kinds of reasons. It could be they're fleeing persecution. It could be even just seeking better economic opportunity. There's nothing immoral about that. People who come here and want to work. I think one person said once to me that the opposition has anecdotes. So they'll talk about Lake and Riley or something, and they'll go on and on about, if there hadn't been an illegal immigrant that admitted she would still be alive. And that's true, but I would say if ICE hadn't invaded Minneapolis, Renee Good would still be alive too. And so does that mean we should abolish ICE? The solution they say for an immigrant that commits a crime is that we stop all immigration. Well, that's you don't tag a whole people with something that one person does. But I actually have, if you'll allow me, I've got a couple of quotes from popes because I think this is important. So Pope Francis just last year says, "The rightly formed conscience cannot fail to make a critical judgment and express its disagreement with any measure that tacitly or explicitly identifies the illegal status of some migrants with criminality." In other words, just because they don't have status doesn't mean they're criminal. Doesn't mean it's immoral. Pope Benedict, before him in 2009, in his encyclical said, "While the poor of the world continue knocking on the doors of the rich, the world of affluence runs the risk of no longer hearing those knocks on account of a conscience that can no longer distinguish what is human." I think that's a really interesting quote because we hear the president saying they're not human, they're animals, and once our conscience sees them that way, then we can justify all kinds of violence against immigrants. So that's why I say I think what we call immigrants is neighbors, not animals, But yeah, it's the problem is we can quote the statistics that Andrea has there and say immigrants are much less likely to commit crimes. And you think about it, they don't want to do anything that's going to mess up their status here. You can be deported for committing a crime, even if you're here legally as an immigrant. And so they're super conscientious about it, and they don't want to fall into the system. But you can quote those statistics, but then somebody will quote, "This person was murdered by an immigrant," and it's like they kind of win the anecdote battle, and we win the statistics battle. But you have to be careful about labeling all immigrants and lumping them all in the same category as some immigrant that is a criminal, because some are, but they're much less likely to. But that's not what gets the headlines. The headlines gets the murder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and earlier when we were chatting, hearing that quote from Pope Benedict, it reminds me of even just saying those broad spectrum groups. It's easy to hate, to say, "Oh, I hate this group of humans."
Yeah, like
and
Somalis.
really hard to say, yes, and really hard to say, "I hate this individual person." And so the example that I always use is it's easy to say, "I hate Mexicans." It's hard to say, "I hate Leanne." Because when you really deduce it down to an individual, not that it is hard to hate me, but it's really hard to look at one single human in the eyes and say, "Oh no, this is about you." Mm-hmm. And so much easier to say, "The faceless Mexican, mm-hmm. That's who I hate. Those group of criminals, this group of individuals who are destroying our country." Yes, the day that I learned that all Mexicans were criminals was a hard day for me to look at my grandfather and go, I had no idea. It just absolutely shocking to think that anybody really truly can believe that. So thank you for sharing all of that.
In our system, people can come in even illegally and be without status, and and sometimes go through certain processes and suddenly become legal,
Yep.
you know? And so did they go from an immoral state to a moral state simply by that? Or take the people who hundreds of thousands of people that are here legally with temporary protected status because we've said it's too dangerous to go back to their country, including Venezuelans, and then the administration revokes that status. Well, they haven't done anything different, but they go from one day being legal to the next day being illegal. You know, does that create some sort of, something we should despise about them? They didn't cause it, but you know, that's just the nature of our system right now. And so we don't want to pin, immorality or sin on somebody who simply is struggling getting through a extremely complex legal system.
Yeah, it's hard to say that there is something immoral about simply existing.
Yeah.
Our next question here is, can undocumented immigrants vote?
No. And if they do...
Non-citizens can't vote.
No. And actually, a big issue we've seen is some of our clients, when they become permanent residents, when they get their green card, they're being told to register to vote when they're not a U.S. citizen yet. And then sometimes it's government agencies that don't understand the process, and then our clients who are permanent residents that should not be registering to vote do, and then they are deemed to have made a false claim to U.S. citizenship and are permanently barred.
Yeah, the false claim is a permanent bar.
Like the unpardonable sin.
But, we had what they called motor voter laws here. When people get their driver's license, they'd register to vote at the same time, and I've had clients say that they were told to register. Now, oftentimes they didn't. I actually have never had anybody tell me they voted, but they have registered and then realized that they're not, they're not legal to vote or anything. But that's hardly their fault. They're told to register when they got their driver's license.
And the statistic here from the handout we gave you shows that from the 1980s, the Heritage Foundation actually has this database. There were 1,546 cases of alleged voter fraud, because we all hear in the news every election, all of the undocumented immigrants that are voting. Well, only 68 of those 1,546 cases pertained to non-citizens. So of the alleged voter fraud, 68 were non-citizens. So again, like Roger said, it's not like we're saying that there is no immigrant that's ever committed a crime. We're not saying that there's no undocumented immigrant that's ever voted, but the statistics over a 40-year period of time were below 0.0001%.
Good gracious.
Yeah, but it's amazing that keeps getting thrown out there all the time.
Yeah.
All these millions of... In fact, I was standing in line to vote in one of the presidential elections, and there was a few people ahead of me that was Asian, and there was a guy right in front of me who said, just loudly, he says, there's 100,000 illegal aliens in this area, and they're all going to vote today. And I said, no, they're not. And I said, and then I said a couple of other things, and then and then he turned away from me and didn't say anything else. But it was because he saw a foreign-looking person in line there and assumed he was illegal. Good
gracious. So, unpacking that a little bit more, do undocumented immigrants pay taxes?
Our clients pay
They sure do.
a ton of taxes. And a lot of times they actually don't get refunds for the taxes that they pay. So in 2023, immigrant households paid a total of $651.9 billion in taxes, with a B, billion. They contributed to $215 billion to Social Security, $58 billion to Medicare. Undocumented households paid $55 billion in taxes and had a combined spending power of $299 billion.
Yeah, particularly, and the way this happens, they file tax returns, but also, employers withhold taxes, and then that goes in and pays income tax, and it is in the multiple billions. Particularly the Social Security fund has been propped up by undocumented immigrants work that they don't get any benefit from it, but it's automatically taken out of their paychecks. That's why, from an economic standpoint, mass deportation makes no sense at all. And every economist will tell you that. I've seen, long before Trump, I saw tons of economic papers saying that, the best thing economically that could happen would be some sort of path to legalization rather than deportation. And in fact, I was reading an article the other day, and the title of it was Trump's plan for mass deportation is economic suicide. And it was an economist that was writing it. And I was kind of horrified when I saw the GOP convention, and they're all holding up these signs saying mass deportation now, because it's like they're not recognizing the economic consequences. I mean, there's humanitarian consequences to it for sure, we're seeing every day, but the economic consequences are really serious as well. And it's not just taxes, I'd say, too. It's the fact that they're consumers, too, They pay rent, they buy things, that, it all creates a boost in the economy. And when we've had programs that have focused on deportation, our gross domestic product has gone down because of it.
One thing I think we can all agree on, Republicans and Democrats, is that we don't like the national deficit. It's just not a good idea generally to be in debt, right? I mean, I think we learn this when we're young. Hopefully, our parents teach us this. And right now, we've got an out-of-control national deficit. The easiest way to wipe it out or get close to it, I'm talking trillions of dollars, would be a comprehensive immigration reform bill that becomes law, that allows the undocumented population in the United States to pay some kind of fee to get a temporary status that could then, after a number of years, convert into a permanent status. Our clients would pay anything to be able to get on that list, to pay that. And then you multiply, if you charged them $1,000 per person, or $5,000 or $10,000, I think they'd pay it, times 12 million people going straight into the coffers of the US government. Like, if you really want to help the national deficit, that's what you do. It resolves the issue. But mass deportations, we're just spending billions of dollars to deport the people that could also ultimately pay off our national deficit. The people that will help our Social Security system continue to thrive. Right now, without the immigrant-born population, we native-born people are not reproducing enough to support the Social Security system and the baby boomers. And there's a lot of statistics about that. It is the immigrant population and their children that are going to help us keep the Social Security fund funded.
Yeah, that's true. We actually, long before Trump, we were talking about comprehensive immigration reform, and part of that is some way of giving an opportunity for people that are here without status to get status. And there's about 12 million people that are truly undocumented. And that's Homeland Security's own statistics. You'll see the administration sometimes talk about 20 million and all this kind of stuff, but they're counting people that are actually here legally that they don't think should have been allowed in. Mm-hmm. But and there have actually been times historically, I mean, within the last 20 years, where one house, either the House of Representatives or the Senate had passed a comprehensive immigration bill that would grant, I mean, you could call it amnesty if you want. It would give people an opportunity to get legal status. And the other house didn't take it up, or, and it's just kind of gone back and forth. But it was actually actively being discussed for years, and there were actual plans on how to implement it. The problem is that, well, we can't ever get everybody together on it, but, of that 12 million or so, the vast majority have no criminal record, but they've also been here for 10 years or more. They came in at a time when, and a big percentage of them are in mixed status families too. So there's that incentive to keep families together, but they have long-term roots in the U.S. and families here, and they've set up businesses and things like that. Well, those are the very ones that are all getting snatched up right now, and what we, in the Obama administration, for example, and in previous ones as well, non-criminal aliens were low priorities for removal. And so Obama had a series of priorities for removal. And the idea is that you have prosecutorial discretion, and you want to focus on the most serious cases. So we don't, when we go down the street, everybody who speeds doesn't get picked up, and because we'd rather focus more attention to rapes and murders and stuff than we would to speeders, so and so he said at the top of his pyramid was criminal aliens and recent arrivals. So people often point out that Obama deported a lot of people. Well, they were people who were caught near the border, typically, and had only been in the U.S. for short periods of time. But for people who had been here long term without criminal records, they might get picked up, but they wouldn't be deported. They'd be asked to report back every now and then, and they were in the system with the hope that eventually there would be some sort of reform that would allow them to get legal status. Most of them that don't have legal status have no way to get legal status, because we have built in certain penalties and bars to people who've either come in illegally or overstayed, and but they're not criminals, and it would make sense to allow families to be united and to get legal status. But when Trump came into office, one of the first things he did was get rid of this policy memo and said everybody's a priority for removal. Well, so that's what we're seeing acted out right now, is you're seeing people with no criminal record being dragged through the streets, their windows broken, and all this kind of stuff, and put in mandatory detention. Like, before Trump, it was very common for somebody might be in the system, but they would be released and asked to report every now and then, or they might even be given an ankle monitor or something like that. Now it's everybody gets detained, and in that detention, they get pressure on to voluntarily remove themselves, no matter what their connections are to the U.S., no matter what kind of family they have here, or non-criminal records, or businesses, or U.S. citizen children, or anything like that. None of that's a consideration. It's everybody's in the same boat. And what that did in the first Trump administration was actually less focus on criminal aliens than Obama had, because they're just focused on everybody, and you can't. Anyway, it was a messed up priorities, but we can do immigration reform if we get the right kind of will. It's not all that complicated, and that's what happened in 1986 with Reagan. People who'd come in by a certain date and were non-criminals, they could come forward, pay a fine, and get legal status, and eventually get citizenship. And it made a lot of sense economically and in a lot of ways. And it's in my view, it's a lot more secure. It's a lot safer to do that. Like, wouldn't you rather have people that are existing in the shadows come forward, be vetted, have criminal background checks, pay fines, and get legal status and continue to contribute to the U.S., rather than hiding in the shadows and not knowing who they are? Doesn't that make a lot more sense?
Have driver licenses, get the driving
get
classes
insurance,
they need to drive it, get insurance. Yeah, absolutely. And I think what Roger just said is it's important to pause here and go back to what we said at the beginning of the conversation, that this is not political. It was Reagan that passed the last good immigration reform. And then Roger just mentioned briefly about these bars that happened in 1996, and that was actually Clinton. So, and then we saw in 2006, 2007, it was George Bush that was trying to pass comprehensive immigration reform. So we have seen Republican presidents in the past that have been champions for immigrants and that have cared a lot and have spoken so highly of immigrants. So I actually think that this is abnormal for the Republican Party based on what we have seen historically in the last 4 or 5 decades.
Yeah, I'll throw in another historical legal point. And And that is, so in 1996, as she said, Clinton signed a law that created bars or penalties for people getting legal status if they overstayed or came in illegally. But we also had a law that said that if you were married to a U.S. citizen, for example, even though you came in illegally, you could pay a fine and still get legal status and stay with your citizen spouse. And the policy or moral implications behind that were that we think it's more important for families to stay together than it is to have successfully navigated a complex immigration legal system. You know, when we're weighing the two, we say, okay, they came in illegally, but they are a family. How about let's support the family? And that law was called 245I. And they could pay a fine, made a lot of money. The immigration system supported it. In 2001, it had to get renewed annually, and Congress had renewed it several times before this law. And so what happened in 2001? We had 9/11, and so it was set to be renewed. Congress was going to vote on it, and then 9/11 happened, and all the anti-immigrant groups said, oh, this is amnesty. We can't give them amnesty. We can't let them get their status by paying a fine. And so that law didn't get renewed. And as a result, it created this vast body of people. And I actually wrote to my Congress people about it. I said, you're going to create an underclass here that has no way to get legal, but they're not going to leave either. And they're connected to families and stuff like that. And that's exactly what's happened. And there's no way for them to get legal status. You know, if they leave the country, they may have a permanent bar to coming back, or at least a 10-year bar. But what's more important, you know, that families stay together, or that they have observed, you know, a Kafkaesque immigration legal system. I mean, it really is. Even the Supreme Court has said it's among the most complex of our laws, comparable to federal income tax law, and we know what that's like, right? And in fact, sometimes I'll say, imagine if you had to do your taxes yourself and do it in another language that you barely know, and if you made a mistake and checked the wrong box, you got permanently barred from the U.S. You know, that's kind of what immigration law is like right now. And so anyway, so that happened in 2001, and we haven't remedied that since then. You know, so we've got a population there that, from every moral perspective, we'd say ought to be allowed to stay here, but they have no legal way of doing it.
And I think a lot of us are asking right now, you see this on the news every day, you see this issue, and you're like, what can we do? It's a mess, right? It is a mess because nothing has been done substantively by Congress for the last 30 years. In this case, if we continue this route, I've heard different statistics on the cost of a single deportation, but some statistics say it's about $5,000 per immigrant to deport. So when we start calculating what $5,000 times, are we going to go after all 12 million? Right? We're going to bankrupt our entire country. And then people are, as long as we are the beacon that we have been, people, shockingly right now, can still want to be here. They still want to come. So there will still be more and more and more demand to be here. So it is unsustainable to deport everyone for our economy. It is way too expensive. It will ultimately bankrupt us instead of doing what needs to be done for our economy, which is a comprehensive immigration reform.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know that we have a couple other questions. I'm very thankful that we have that information for you that you get to take home. But I also want to open it up and just see what is on your mind, since we have two experts with us who have so graciously shared their time. So if you have a question, I would love for you to just raise your hand, stand up, and say your question out loud. I'll repeat that question. We do have some recordings going on, and so then Andrea and Roger can address that. Does anybody have any questions, anything on your mind? Yes, I'll go with you in the gray shirt.
Okay. My name is Jan. I have a question If it costs $5,000 to deport, why are they trying to build all these detention centers? You know,
Yeah, Jan's question was if it costs $5,000 to deport, why are we trying to build all of these detention centers?
Well, it's part of the deportation process. I mean, they detain people. People may have a legal right to claim a benefit, but then they get put in long-term detention, and it is very common for our clients to say, I don't care, I just want to go home. I can't stand being detained. And but yeah, you might have more to add to that.
So the detention centers are because the Trump administration wants to detain more people, to deport more people. So what they do is they pick up Luis on the street in KCK, and then they house him for a short period of time in whatever county jail ICE might have a contract with, Chase County, Platte County, et cetera, Greene County. Then they ship them to what they call a holding facility. There's a big one in Louisiana, and that's where they hold the immigrant until they get enough immigrants of that same country together to put on a plane, to fill a plane, to take them to Honduras, for example.
It's a complex system because sometimes the country they're from won't allow them to be sent back there too, and they have to, and so that sometimes they're held long terms. Now they've started sending them to third countries where they have no connection. Even like Latin American immigrants are getting sent to Uganda or somewhere, and but yeah, but sometimes they have like a pending asylum case or something like that, but they'll give that right up in order to not be detained. So like I said before, we in the past people would be allowed to be here with work authorization while waiting for their benefits to be processed, and that's not happening now.
Yep.
Robin.
Hi, my name's Robin. I am curious to know if you all have an opinion on which of the apps or action networks that are out there that provide information for where ICE is currently active in the city, because there are so many that are popping up now, like ICE Out and the AIRR and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Do you have a suggestion for which one is going to be the quickest to hear from, or which one is going to be the most reliable?
So there's a signal group. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Robin's question was if there is an app or a service that would be most reliable in terms of the location or projects that ICE is working on at the present moment.
So there's a rapid response group on Signal that is one of the quickest ways. There's also, she mentioned AIRR, it's Advocates
For immigration
immigrant
reform, something like
Rights
that.
and Reconciliation.
Oh, maybe that's
kind
it,
of
yeah.
kind of a bunch of letters, but AIR. Thank you, thank you.
Good.
They're fantastic, and you can actually do know your rights presentations through them. You can do accompaniment. I was just about thinking it in Spanish, but accompaniment. For immigrants that are going to their ICE check-ins. So if you're a U.S. citizen and would like to accompany an undocumented immigrant to their ICE check-in, we really need that right now because we don't have time to be going sometimes with every single one of our clients. And it's really helpful because people are so scared. So I highly recommend AIRR, we call it AIR, and they have a phenomenal volunteer program that they need more volunteers.
Wonderful question. Yes. You don't need to stand up. No, absolutely not.
I work with a refugee resettlement through Del Lam, and our family came last year, and they still haven't got all their immunizations to apply for the green card. Is there a fear to go and apply now for them, to go apply and go to the office and do that?
Brenda's question was that she works with a family that is potentially going to get immunizations for the purpose of then going to get a green card. Is there fear at this point with regard to even applying for a green card?
And one thing she said that was an important detail is that they're refugees. You can apply And it's going to be held because the Trump administration has now said that they're holding and not adjudicating refugee adjustments. So yeah, you can file it, and you should, I think, file it, and make sure you file a work card application with it so they can at least get an employment authorization document while the extension, while the application for the green card is pending. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree. I think they should go ahead and file, but yeah, there's a hold on it. It's important to talk about refugees. The refugees are processed outside the United States by the UN High Commission for Refugees, and they are extremely vetted in their background, and typically they're coming from refugee camps. And like the Somalis that I used to represent all came from refugee camps in Kenya and Ethiopia, but the typical stay in a refugee camp is like 10 years before they can get resettled. And it's not just the U.S., they get resettled all around the world. But we've had quotas on how many refugees we'd accept every year, and it was like 105,000 or something like that. And then in the first Trump term, he knocked it down to 15,000 or something like that.
Yeah, almost.
And then in this term, they've said zero new. In fact, there were a lot of them who had already been approved to be resettled and had families to join. You probably know this from Della Lamb. Had families to join here in the U.S., and they weren't allowed to come in. And so now they've decided we can admit South Africans, white South Africans, as refugees when they're not even being processed by the UNHCR. They would not, under any legal definition, qualify as refugees. But, I mean, you can take that for what it's worth. It's pretty obvious what that's about, But that is the only refugees, quotes refugees, because I don't consider them really refugees. Right. But that's the only refugees that we're admitting to the U.S. now. And like I said, there was like 100,000 that I'd read had been approved for resettlement that are now not being admitted, and most of them had family in the U.S. to be united with.
Della Lamb is an awesome organization, by the way.
Yeah, no, they're one of two or three that do the refugee resettlement, but I mean, there's no new refugees coming in right now too. So a lot of those organizations have had to lay off people or even close, because of that.
Nikki.
I noticed the Netflix documentary that one of the couples went to Canada. Is this a viable option for people? How did you do that?
I think I need to get another license in outbound immigration, because I've gotten so many questions lately.
Yeah.
Like, can I go to Italy?
So Nikki's question was, one of the families in living undocumented chose to go to Canada. So the question was, is that a viable option at this point?
So what I would say is, because that's case specific, if you know someone who's interested, then we would connect you. We are members of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. We have colleagues in Canada, and we would connect you with a Canadian immigration attorney who can tell you your options in Canada. Because just like the United States, they have their own immigration laws, and you have to fit whatever category they say you might fit under.
They have generally been much more welcoming than the U.S. has in the past few years. But yeah, it's not like 1700s in the U.S. I mean, they still have a lot of legal things to go through. And it is very case specific, like Andrea said.
Yes, here in the back in the gray jacket.
I'd like to know, I think we have some real fears about real things happening, whether they're in brand new, whether they're in the county, we don't know. But we hear that people are being impacted day to day. What are my rights if I'm approached or if near and I say, what are my rights if they come to my door? What are my rights if they ask me about a neighbor? What are my actual rights I can have?
As a U.S. citizen, not in your house, just in the street. So obviously, if you're in your house, well, I should say obviously, but after today's memo, when you're in your house, you have no obligation to open the door if they don't have a judicial warrant. Let's start there. But a lot of people now, the question is, I'm out protesting in the street, or I'm just in the street and an ICE agent stops me. What are my rights? Go ahead. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, that was the
I'm
question.
repeating this.
Yeah, you got it.
And so you have the right to film. You have the right to take your phone out and record. So that's the first thing. You'll hear them say, put your phone down, quit, and they'll try to knock it out of people's hands. You've probably seen that. You have a right to film what's happening in public. So that's something that's very important. Now, also be respectful. There is a way to speak where you can speak firmly and assertively, but calmly, to not escalate the situation. And that's important. I actually learned that the hard way through this lawsuit, is that if you, and I'm very thankful that we didn't escalate the situation, but if you do, they're going to use that as the excuse to use force against you. So you want to stay calm and try to de-escalate the situation. Now, as far as asking you about immigrant neighbors, I don't think you have any obligation to tell them anything.
No. And you don't really even have to show them an ID unless, if you're driving a car, there is an obligation to have an ID. And you can be questioned about, although that's not ICE's job.
Do you need to show ID
If
to an
what?
ICE agent?
Do you
If they
need to-
ask of your ID?
No, you don't, but I mean, you might decide that that's,
That's the question, is
Yeah.
that there are a lot of gray areas right now on what you have to do versus maybe what you should do to de-escalate the situation, particularly with what we saw with Renee Good and how the administration is responding. So you can say, I'm not going to give you my ID, and then they might detain you until you prove that you're a U.S. citizen.
yeah, there's a lot of videos of that. They say they detain people until they can identify them. That shouldn't be that way, and ICE is not police. You know, a lot of their uniforms say ICE police, but they're not police. They don't have the authority to enforce traffic regulations and stuff like that. You know, regular police can demand an ID if you're driving, but on the other hand, like, is it wise to refuse to provoke them? I don't know. But you certainly don't have to give them ID, and you don't have to let them in your car or open the door. You certainly don't have to let them in your house unless they have, like Andrea said, a judicial warrant. That they have things that look like warrants that are administrative warrants that are just signed by ICE agents. But
So she's saying, can you refuse to
Yeah,
open the door?
refuse to open
So
the
you
door.
can refuse to open the door. Now, right now, they might bust your window in and pull you out of the car. So that's where I'm saying, even though you can refuse, in the administration that we're in, it's, I think, a pretty personal decision whether you're going to want to deal with what might come next as opposed to just showing them the ID.
Yeah. I appreciate, Andrea, that you said to approach respectfully still. And I think that one thing that I consistently will say, and I get the incredible privilege of occasionally being able to throw out a sermon, and I will almost always talk about the Imago Dei when I preach, which is that we are created in the image of God. And I think that it is important to recognize that immigrants, like all of us, were created in the image of God, and so were ICE agents. So were all of the other individuals that we fundamentally disagree with occasionally, those people that we are in company with always. It is the one thing that I simply cannot compromise on. We were all created in the image of God. And so I think as we go from this conversation, I'm so thankful for the ways in which we can honor one another, we can honor our neighbors, we can honor all of those that we encounter, knowing that we were each created in the image of God, and that our calling as Christians is to love and to pursue justice. And I am so deeply thankful for each of you, not only for giving your time tonight, but for the work that you do for our neighbors, for our community, for all of those who you impact in our community and beyond through all of the things that you have done. Thank you, thank you, thank you.